So welcome to the series of lessons that are based on John Leslie Mackie's essay that he wrote in 1977 called Evil and Omnipotence. And so this also is part of the Edexcel A Level in Religion, Philosophy and Ethics, and it makes up one of the philosophy anthology extracts. So it's really important that you've actually read the extract of Mackie's essay before you work your way through these series of lessons. We'll start with a little bit about John Mackie. He was an Australian philosopher. He was known for his works actually on ethics, but he came to prominence in 1977 when he defended atheism in his Evil and Omnipotence essay. He wrote a book that you can see there later on called The Miracle of Theism, which I believe was most likely published after his death in 1983, looking for arguments for and against the existence of God. At the bottom we can see a quote by Anthony Campbell, who's a physician, a philosopher, and he reviews The Miracle of Theism, Mackie's book. And his interesting insight, he says that Mackie has little difficulty in demonstrating that no theodicy, which is a defense for God's existence, worth the name, will stand up to logical criticism. So we get a sense straight away of what Mackie is going to be doing. He's going to be wanting to demonstrate that there is, at the end of the day, no defense that will be able to stand up to specifically logical arguments. Very clearly, Mackie's essay is broken into two parts. Part A, called Adequate Solutions, and Part B, called Fallacious Solutions. In Part A, if we were to summarize in essence what he's doing, he's outlining the adequate solutions by some religious thinkers. And you will be exposed to be reminded of some of the things in Year 12 AS philosophy that you've studied, and you will be reminded of those things. Some of the theodicies you will encounter in this essay. It's a very good source of revision. And so Mackie outlines adequate solutions by some religious thinkers. He admits that they work to some extent, but the phrase that he uses to describe them are half-hearted. He doesn't believe that they take the idea of evil seriously enough. And so as we work our way through Mackie's essay, you'll have a paragraph of the extract up on the screen. You'll have in blue the summary of that extract, that section, and you should make notes on that. And then in the black boxes, you'll have questions come up, as you can see, and those questions will help you understand, they'll help you clarify and illustrate the essay itself. And that will help you with the 10-mark essay that you have to write in your exam. And then there'll be further points and questions and critiques that will come in, and that will help you analyze the essay, which will lend itself much better to help you with the 20-mark essay in your exam. At the outset, we can see very clearly familiar ideas being presented. And so Mackie refers to what he calls the traditional arguments for the existence of God. And the traditional arguments are the things that you've studied: design argument, cosmological argument, ontological argument. And then he mentions that these have been fairly thoroughly criticized by philosophers. Now, the critics that he's thinking of are people like David Hume, Immanuel Kant, Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, and in fact himself, John Mackie. When criticized, he argues some religious people turn to religious experiences, and he calls that a non-rational argument because he believes that they're based on personal accounts and they have no physical evidence to back up their point, in which case he believes there's no longer a logical argument to defend God by religious people. So instead of attacking the evidence for belief in God, what does Mackie actually attack here? Well, if we look, he actually attacks the belief itself. And we can see that here when he says, here it can be shown not that religious beliefs lack rational support, but that they are positively irrational. Religious beliefs are positively irrational. So he attacks the belief itself. Now, what else can we highlight that he aims to show the idea of God as other than non-rational? Well, we've already highlighted that when he refers to religious beliefs as being positively irrational. So do you agree at this stage with Mackie that it seems religious believers have been defeated by criticisms of traditional arguments, and so they turn to religious experience instead of a posteriori evidence? Now, it's worth noting here that his understanding of religious experiences are that they are personal and therefore very subjective and individual. And therefore, they don't contain physical evidence, which is why he believes that they don't have a posteriori evidence, knowledge from experience. This is a point for you to decide whether you think that what Mackie is saying here is true of most religious people, that they will turn to religious experiences, which is very difficult to prove. Look at the year that Mackie wrote the essay, 1977. Now, what modern arguments can you remember that you've studied for the cosmological and the ontological arguments that may have meant Mackie spoke too soon? Well, hopefully you can think of the Kalam argument, which William Lane Craig resurrects, which is an old Islamic argument, cosmological argument, to prove the existence of God. We also have modal arguments by Malcolm and Plantinga. These are arguments which moved on the classic forms of the cosmological and the ontological argument and enabled certain criticisms to be avoided. And so perhaps Mackie has spoke a little bit too soon, because after he came up with this essay, there were other arguments which meant religious people didn't have to fall back on religious experience claims to prove the existence of God. Now, could Mackie be guilty of what's called a straw man fallacy right at the outset of this essay? What is a straw man fallacy? Well, this is when someone distorts an original argument to simply suit their point. It's as if they're clutching at straws. Perhaps religious faith in God has always been based on religious experience in the first instance. Maybe Mackie's missing something here. If we think a little bit about the Bible, and we think about how Paul the Apostle in the New Testament, a lot of what's written there in the letters that he writes to churches has been based on his religious experiences first. So maybe it's the fact that experience comes first and then theology afterwards. Now, moving along, Mackie introduces the problem of evil, which is what we expect him to do. And he says why it is important. He refers to evil, omnipotent, and the phrase holy good, which make up the inconsistent triad as we know it. He assumes that you already know what that is already. Let's just highlight these phrases. So he refers to evil, and he refers to omnipotent, and he refers to holy good. And it almost creates a bit of a triangle when you highlight it like that. Now, what are the three distinctions that Mackie makes when interpreting the problem of evil? We can find them in this paragraph. So the first is the logical aspect, the logical problem. This is where he believes the concept of God is irrational. The second is the scientific problem. This is where Mackie would argue that there needs to be more evidence to prove God's existence. And then there is the practical, moral duty, the practical problem, the moral duty to do good and not to abuse free will. These are the three distinctions that he makes when interpreting the problem of evil. So which aspect of the problem of evil matters to Mackie in this particular essay? Well, the focus that he has is on the logical problem of evil, and that is his focus, not the scientific or the practical, he says, but it's the logical problem. that he has to focus on. Now, what might Mackie be accusing some religious people of at this stage of doing when they defend God against the problem of evil? Well, he focuses on the scientific and the practical aspects to avoid answering the logical one. Not rather Mackie does, but he accuses religious people of doing this. And that's why he focuses on the logical aspect. He believes religious people, when they defend God, they emphasize the science, they emphasize the moral issues in order to avoid the logical contradictions. Sometimes ignored, it says here, by theologians. Now, this accusation implies that religious people are moving the goalposts in order to focus on the other aspects. They're changing and shifting their focus of their argument to avoid the contradictions that they make. Now, what if here Mackie was wrong to make a distinction? Think about what John Hick would say about the scientific evidence, for example. There's John Hick. What would he say? Well, Hick would discuss the eschatological verification principle. If you remember, he would argue that we're going to find out the answers to these questions in the afterlife. What other theodicy would John Hick put forward here that deals with the practical aspect of having a moral duty to do good? Well, this would be his veil of soul-making theodicy. So John Hick would actually be able to come in and defend here the scientific and the practical aspects that Mackie says religious people focus on to avoid the logical problem. But actually, the distinction may not be necessary. Can Mackie show that there cannot be eschatological evidence? Well, of course he can't show that, because he's not dead at this stage of writing the essay. And at the moment, he's not coming back anytime soon to tell us whether or not he found out. Can he prove that the world is not a veil of soul-making, as John Hick describes? Of course he cannot, because Mackie, in his essay, only can assume. So we may ask instead, as an analytical criticism of Mackie, who is moving the goalposts? Is it Mackie, or is it the religious believers? I'll leave that for you to decide. So moving on, Mackie outlines the problem of evil and the problem it creates for the classical God of theism. What is Mackie explaining here? You should draw and label this. This is the inconsistent triad. It points out that in a world in which evil exists, if there is a God who is omnipotent and a God who is omnibenevolent, surely there is a contradiction, there is an inconsistency in this triad of concepts. What's the phrase that Mackie uses here to define the God that he is discussing? Well, we can see it here when he refers to God, or belief in God here, as ordinary theism. And this is effectively Mackie's way of saying the God of classical theism. And it's really important, as we know most philosophers will do at the beginning of a debate or an essay, they will define the terms in which they're using. And that's simply because in this case, there are other religious ideas out there like Hinduism, a pantheist religion that believes that God can be both good and evil. And therefore, his whole argument of critiquing an inconsistent triad like this would fall to pieces because it simply wouldn't apply. So it's important to note we're discussing the God of classical theism, often understood as the Abrahamic faith's belief in God. The God of Judaism, of Islam, and of Christianity. So now Mackie goes on to clarify his definitions of good, evil, and omnipotent. So let's start with, how does he define what is good? Well, we should highlight this idea. He says good is opposed to evil, and it will eliminate evil as far as it can. Really important you hold on to that definition of good throughout his essay, because he comes back to it at a later point. Now, what would an omnibenevolent and all good and loving God without this definition want to do? Well, if an all-loving God wasn't defined as being opposed to evil and eliminating evil as far as it can, then this God would want to create more good without caring how much evil still exists. How does he define omnipotence in this extract? Well, omnipotence is defined as something where there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. No limits whatsoever. Putting these two definitions together, what is Mackie's conclusion? Well, Mackie says it makes it incompatible for a good, omnipotent thing and evil to coexist. Now, while most theists would agree with Mackie's definition of omnipotence, there are varying ideas. Aquinas said that God can do all things that are possible. And this is something we need to remember throughout the essay as well. He wants to often refer back to ideas that are illogical, and he posits lots and lots of contradictions for you to work through in the essay. But for Catholics, Aquinas, who one of the greatest Catholic influencers, said that God can do all things that are possible, which is a paraphrased scripture from the Bible. So what would that mean for a four-sided triangle? Doesn't seem to make sense. It would mean that God wouldn't be able to create a four-sided triangle because he can only do things which are logically possible. And so we move on to part A, which is the first section in which Mackie outlines the obvious ways a religious person, a theist, would avoid the problem of evil by adopting less extreme beliefs to begin with. And he calls these adequate solutions. And this is because they attempt to avoid the logical aspect of the problem of evil. So let's highlight and explain the three ways that Mackie suggests the problem of evil can be removed. The first way is to change the definition of God. This is what he says one of these adequate solutions of these theists do. They change the definition of God. God is not wholly good or not quite omnipotent. So he's not fully omnibenevolent, he's not fully omnipotent, therefore they have changed God's definition. The second, he says, that what they do is deny the existence of evil. Evil does not exist. And the third thing that they do is they change the definition of goodness. This is where he writes, good is not opposed to the kind of evil that exists. Now, when looking at the triad, that image again, why does Mackie call these three ways adequate solutions? He calls them adequate solutions because they make the triad look consistent. If you adapt the definition of God as good and minimize his or limit his omnipotence, if you claim that evil doesn't exist, then you remove an aspect of the contradiction, and therefore the inconsistent triad is no more. It makes it look consistent. Which theodicy have you studied that does a similar thing? You've got it. It's process theology. This is where God is evolving as part of the universe. He's not omnipotent, but he is growing in goodness. And one day, when all of us are developed, evil will cease and will end. Mackie says that one of these adequate solutions that theists posit would be one like, for example, Whitehead's process theology. So here, Mackie goes into detail on some of these adequate solutions and quotes a famous poet called Alexander Pope to summarize. Mackie points out those who redefine omnipotence like Aquinas. Aquinas did this. Let's highlight the quote. Quite a number of things, quite a number of things that an omnipotent being cannot do. That's effectively the quote that points out what Aquinas does, limiting some of the things that God cannot, or can do rather, by saying there are things that he cannot do. So what are the two views that he has on temporal order under the idea of evil as an illusion? Evil is an illusion. So temporal order is the world within time, the world of temporal, the world within time. And this is an illusion, an illusion. Eastern religions, for example, often will hold this view that everything in this world is actually not real. There is a greater reality beyond. The other view is that the temporal order is real, but evil is an illusion. And you can find that here. They held, although temporal things are much as we see them, what we call evil is not really real. So one of the views is that the temporal order is an illusion, this world is an illusion, but changing things is not. And then we've got the temporal order being real, but evil is the illusion. Now, can you remember Augustine's view, which argues that the temporal order is real, so this world is real, but evil is an illusion? You can find it here. It's what we call evil is merely the privation of good. This is Augustine's, one of his most famous points that he makes, that evil is not a thing, it is an illusion. Here's the quote from Alexander Pope. And this is the full quote, actually, that Mackie uses. All nature is but art, unknown to thee, all chance, direction, which thou canst not see, all discord, harmony, not understood, all partial evil, universal good. And we can see this here. Disorder is harmony, not understood. Partial evil is universal good. There's the full quote. Pope is saying that things might seem bad, but that's because you're looking at them in the wrong way. If you saw the bigger picture, then you would realize that they're not bad at all. When he says partial evil is really a universal good, he's saying that it's a universal good in the end. We only see things in part. We don't see the bigger picture, which a creator like God can and will. So what does Mackie say will happen if you accept these adequate solutions that he's presenting? Well, he says that you won't have a logical problem of evil anymore, but you're going to have, and here you should highlight, other problems to face. So it's not really a good enough solution after all. It's one of the reasons he calls it an adequate solution. So let's just think a little bit beyond this for a minute. Is Mackie saying that Augustine's view about evil is an adequate solution? Aquinas accepted Augustine's view, and consequently the entire Catholic Church did. So if so, who is Mackie really arguing with here? Because these are some big players in religious faith. And let's take the discussion a little bit further, just for you to ponder. Would limiting God's omnipotence mean having faith in him to do all things is actually pointless? If you're a religious person and you believe that God can do all things, just like Aquinas said, although he says he can do all things that are logically possible, if you limit God's omnipotence, does that mean the statement he can do all things actually becomes pointless? Or think about this, if the temporal order, if this world is simply an illusion, then why on earth should we ever bother to do good and to try and change it? Because the whole thing isn't really real. Or what about this? If evil and suffering isn't really a thing, as Augustine believed, is it possible then to actually ever resist temptation? Because temptation isn't a thing. Is it ever possible to truly comfort somebody? Because actually what they're suffering isn't really real. And so Mackie goes on to explain problems with these adequate solutions. He accuses theists who adopt them of being inconsistent and insincere. He suspects that they really do believe in omnipotence and evil at the end of the day. So what other contexts do you think theists might believe God's power is unlimited in? What other contexts do you believe that that theists would say God's power is unlimited? And here's the quote, in other contexts. This is what Mackie's referring to. He's referring to when religious people will pray for a miracle. When they pray for a miracle, they believe God's power is unlimited. He can do anything if he wants to. So what does Mackie suspect that theists really believe about evil as an illusion? Well, he believes that the illusion itself must therefore be evil. You can highlight that here, that this illusion is itself an evil. Therefore, evil still exists, and it doesn't avoid the logical aspect. Interesting here, Mackie is accusing the religious people who come up with these adequate solutions where they change a little bit about the context of God's nature. He's accusing them of still actually, whilst they might say evil isn't a thing, they still end up having to believe that it really is. So it doesn't avoid the logical problem after all. Now, Mackie compares the idea that people still believe some things are evil, despite rejecting the existence of evil. And he does this using the naturalistic fallacy, which you will have learned about in ethics. Here it is, the naturalistic fallacy in ethics. So let's just briefly remind ourselves and unpack what the naturalistic fallacy is. Well, the naturalistic fallacy, brought up by G.E. Moore in his work Principia Ethica. The naturalistic fallacy argues that it is a mistake to explain ethics in terms of something natural. Let's take evolution, for example. Critics of traditional ethics will use this so that they can base ideas of how to behave on something other than goodness. They don't want that. And the fallacy that Moore points out is that they still believe that it is good to evolve, and they don't get rid of the idea of goodness after all. And how do we relate this to the rejection of evil? Well, Mackie's saying that this is happening by the religious people when they discuss evil. They still bring in the idea that some things are evil. Now, you may notice that in the text of this section of this slide, Mackie goes back to Alexander Pope's poem again, but you just need to know that he's repeating the same point again. We don't need to write or know anything new about that. So instead, let's just take it a little bit further. The persecution, for example, of Muslims in Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma, by the Buddhist majority is considered to be a modern-day genocide. You can see a picture here of Angelina Jolie, who urges Myanmar to end violence against the Rohingya Muslims. Now, many of these Muslims will have prayed for Allah to alleviate their suffering. Does Alexander Pope's poem bring comfort to them? Should they change their viewpoint and look for the universal good instead? Instead of praying for Allah to alleviate their suffering, they should be asking Allah to continue their suffering so that they get some kind of universal good that comes out of a partial suffering over time. Do you agree with that? And so, coming to the end of part A, Mackie concludes that he doesn't regard the adequate solutions as adequate after all. They, in fact, he says, are unsatisfactory, inconsistent solutions. In what way does Mackie suggest that believers reject one part of the inconsistent triad? He says that they do it in a half-hearted or temporary way. It's a short-term rejection to solve the problem of evil, but it doesn't last. What does he suggest that they do after rejecting one of his propositions? It says here, what they do is they covertly reassert, they secretly bring back the idea or the belief elsewhere in their system of thinking. And that's why he calls them adequate solutions, because it makes sense to get rid of one of the aspects of God in order, the definitions of God, in order to solve the problem of evil. But in the end, after everything, it remains unsatisfactory and almost some secret sly move where they put back into the argument secretly the fact that maybe God really is still omnipotent or evil really is a thing after all. But imagine this. There are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. There are 1 billion Hindus, and all those who accept process theodicy in the world also exist that argue that God is limited in his omnipotence. Couldn't we actually end up saying that all of these people, which is what Mackie suggests, are fools, and all of these people are hypocrites? There's a lot of them. Or just because a majority believe in something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is truth. And so we move on to part B, known as fallacious solutions. And here he outlines some religious thinkers. They are fallacious because they are a logical contradiction. And he's very clever because he attacks, in very Mackie style, the broad arguments, and he lets the theists, the religious people, refine their responses and come back. And then he criticizes each and every one of them so that they end up with nothing left to argue. It's a very clever ploy. So we start with part B, fallacious solutions. Here Mackie deals with the majority of theists who are not willing to abandon their traditional beliefs about God and offer better solutions. It's worth reminding yourself that part A focuses on less traditional beliefs like process theology. Here, part B focuses on some of the more traditional arguments that you should be familiar with, and you will find out what ones they are as we go through. What is the name given to these solutions? Well, the name we use is a theodicy, theodicies, and theodicies are defenses of God. What are the 5 theodicies that you would have studied in year 12? Well, let me remind you, the Augustinian, the Irenaean, Hick's, John Hick's soul making, that's 3, Plantinga's free will defense, that's 4, and Whitehead's process theodicy. Now, what's the difference, according to Mackie, between the adequate solutions and the fallacious solutions? Well, this is what he says. Adequate solutions, and this is what you should highlight, explicitly reject the traditional belief, but they implicitly assert, they secretly reinstate the belief later on back into the argument. And that's what we just looked at a minute ago. Fallacious solutions, however, explicitly maintain the traditional beliefs, but they implicitly reject, they secretly abandon them after all. And they don't really let you in on the fact that that's what they're doing. So let's move on. Here, Mackie mentions the many so-called solutions. Let's highlight that. Many so-called solutions. He mentions these and is referring to some of the most famous theodicies that you will already be familiar with. What does Mackie say happens next after the theodicies secretly will give up their traditional belief that they're claiming to still hold on to? Well, he says they appear to retain the belief. Where can we see that? Appears to have been retained. Now, what does this mean for the argument? It's simply not valid, because it only appears to solve the problem of evil rather than actually solve the problem of evil. And so Mackie calls it fallacious, because the whole thing is full of flaws and errors because of that. They're not willing to give up the belief, but yet secretly they do in order to solve the problem. How does Mackie suggest that theists cover up their secret abandoning? Well, this is what you should highlight. He says that they move to and fro between, say, two of the constituent propositions. They're going back and forth between the propositions that they're putting forward. Why are they doing that? It's to cover up the secret abandoning. It's to cover up the way that they actually end up giving up the traditional belief without letting you know. What else does Mackie say that they do? He says this: they turn upon some equivocation. Now, you should remember this phrase, because later on we revisit it and we turn it against Mackie. He says that they turn upon some equivocation. What is it to have equivocal language? Well, it's language which is vague, which is muddled about the definitions of things. And in this case, Mackie's referring to the muddling of the definitions between good and between evil or omnipotence. He's saying that they muddle up the words that they are using in order to confuse the listener to the arguments and make it sound more persuasive. So here's a question for you. Do you agree, and looking at the inconsistent triad there, that there is no logical way of holding on to all traditional beliefs that make up the triad without appearing to and then abandoning one of them? Do you really think that this is what happens when people of traditional religious belief try and defend God? Let's move on. One of the most popular solutions is now dealt with. The idea that we have to put up with evil if we want to have goodness. You can see they get numbered in the essay. Number one, good cannot exist without evil, or evil is necessary as a counterpart to good. What is an analogy often used to show that goodness makes no sense without evil? Well, you may remember when you studied the problem of evil. Lightness makes no sense without darkness. In the same way, whiteness makes no sense without the concept of blackness. If you don't have blackness, you wouldn't know what whiteness is. If you don't have darkness, you wouldn't know what lightness is. And in the same way, this particular belief is that Goodness makes no sense whatsoever unless you have evil. Now, what are the concepts that without their opposites, we wouldn't have much understanding? Think about some qualities. Honesty. Honesty without lies. You wouldn't know what it is to be honest unless you understood what it was to be dishonest, for someone to lie. Now, for Mackie, these solutions are considered, remember, fallacious, full of errors. They only appear to work rather than actually work. Look at the word here that comes up, which shows how they do this. It's this word here, qualifying. Mackie says that they are qualifying. In other words, they are changing the meaning of something by justifying it in a different way, some of those traditional beliefs. Just ever so slightly, they are changing the meaning of it in order to make it appear to solve the problem of evil. Now here, Mackie introduces a debate about the meaning of omnipotence. He argues that there are two meanings used by theists, but the solution only works with one of them. So first of all, how does Mackie divide omnipotence into two types? So it isn't particularly clear straight away when you read it as to where he breaks up and makes the distinction between the two types of omnipotence. If we take the first type, it would be this sentence here. I think that some theists at least have maintained that God can do what is logically impossible. Now, what Mackie would refer to this as is strong omnipotence. This is the belief that God has the power to do anything, even when it's an illogical impossibility. So earlier we talked about a triangle with four sides. God can do it. The other way of thinking about omnipotence is near the beginning of this paragraph. There are some limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. Now, this is what Mackie would refer to as weak or limited omnipotence, where God has the power to do anything logically possible, but he cannot do the impossible. It doesn't mean he has less power. It means it's what makes sense. Now, can you remember who argues for weak, limited omnipotence? Think back to the beginning of the essay. Well, we mentioned briefly earlier on Aquinas. God can do all things that are possible. This is a very Catholic belief. It's one of the reasons why we might say, Mackie says, it's the most common belief. We can see that when he says it here. It is perhaps the most common theistic view. Now, what implication does the weak, limited view of omnipotence have on the problem of evil? Well, I want you to think for a minute of a triangle without three sides. It would make it logically impossible for goodness to exist without evil. Think about that. It would make it logically impossible for goodness to exist without evil. Now, the Bible is clear for Christians that God can do anything. It's linked to the belief that God created all logic and all morality. If you go back to your ethics, when you studied divine command theory, we learn that God creates the moral law, but he could have, if he wanted to, created it differently, but he didn't. Now, for a theist to accept weak or limited omnipotence, what must it not be suggesting? If you're going to accept the widely held view that God can do all things which are logically possible, therefore he's got weak or limited omnipotence, what must it not be suggesting? Well, it just simply doesn't suggest that God lacks the power So you can hold on to a limited view of omnipotence and at the same time not have to say that God has less power. Here's C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis, who was famous for being an Oxford and Cambridge professor at different points in his life and writing the Chronicles of Narnia, which you may be familiar with, he said this: "Meaningless combinations of words do not suddenly acquire meaning simply because we prefix to them the two other words, God can." What does this quote by C.S. Lewis suggest logical impossibilities really are? What C.S. Lewis would say is that they are not things at all. Logical impossibilities, just because you say God can do this, God can create a triangle with four sides, it doesn't make it meaningful. The language used is senseless, it's nonsensical. We could ask these questions for further discussion, and I've linked this to your study in Islam. If evil is necessary for goodness, then evil must exist in Jannah, in paradise. But Jannah is without evil. How does that work? If we need evil for goodness and evil must exist then in heaven in order to understand what is perfectly good, that heaven doesn't have evil because it's a place of holiness and perfection. What about this one? Does Jahannam, which is hell, represent the existence of evil instead? Maybe that's the antidote. That's the balance. But think about this. Will the memory of evil and suffering exist in Jannah, in heaven? Will people, when they die and go to heaven, remember the suffering and the evil that happened? Because to my knowledge, if one remembers their suffering, they suffer because of sadness in their memory. And so does that mean God will have to wipe out the memory of evil and suffering in heaven? It's food for thought. Now, even if we accept the idea of God's omnipotence being limited to logical possibilities, Mackie still thinks that this solution doesn't work. And he argues in this section that it involves confused thinking about good being opposed to evil. Now let's highlight where one of the earlier definitions Mackie had for good or evil is found in this passage here. It's where he says a good thing will not eliminate evil as far as it can. That's a reminder of his definition from earlier. Now, what does he say the solution has done to the definition here? Well, he says that the solution suggests that they are counterparts, and we can highlight that word here, rather than opposites. Instead of saying things are good or that things are bad, what does Mackie argue that they can be related to instead? Well, we go back to the text. He says that they can be related to the idea, for example, of being great and small. Now, what type of terms are these terms, and how are they used? Well, they are relative terms. We can see it here when he says great is used relatively. They're relative terms. So let's think about it like this. A £10 note is greater than a £5 note, but it's smaller than a £20 note. However, £10 is not the opposite of £5. That doesn't make sense. We wouldn't say that. It doesn't, therefore, possess greatness by itself, but it's a relative use of the word. It has a number of different meanings and flexible ways in which you can apply it. Now, what relative terms here might substitute good and evil. But let's go back to the text. Mackie suggests here you could use words like better or worse. And you can see the word better has just been ringed in red. These are relative terms for good and evil. But think about this. It would surely mean that God is just a bit better than the devil, rather than the devil is evil, God is good. God would be a bit better than the devil. Is this a view that most theists have of God? Of course it isn't. Most religious people that are traditional in their views would say that God is morally perfect and he possesses goodness. If good just means better, then God doesn't want us to be good. He just wants us to be better than we are now. Now, this means that evil wouldn't be necessary for goodness. So think about this. What kind of argument, and this is clever, has Mackie used in this bit of his essay? Can you find it here? Let's highlight it. And it would be absurd to think of a movement in favor, etc. It's called reductio ad absurdum. Do you remember that from the ontological argument? It's something that Anselm used. Reductio ad absurdum. It forces the theist, when Mackie writes this, to abandon one of their premises. Remember, they're trying to hold on to the traditional beliefs about God in this solution, in the fallacious solutions. They're holding on to their traditional beliefs, and Mackie here forces them to abandon one of their premises, that God is perfectly and morally good. So, which theodicy might accept goodness as a relative term? You've got it, it's process theology. But remember, Mackie has just dealt with that in part A with the adequate solutions. So we've already annihilated that one as being half-hearted and not very good. So what does Mackie refer to it as? Adequate solution. Aquinas said this: God is the same as his essence. Now, how might this deal with goodness as a quality of God? Well, instead of saying that God possesses goodness as a quality, we could actually end up arguing that he is goodness. Goodness is God and God is goodness. Perhaps this deals with Mackie's point. So we move on. Mackie stops to consider the idea here that his analogy between good and between great might be wrong. So he says, what if great has an absolute meaning and actually isn't relative at all? We've just been saying that his use of these terms are relative. Now he concedes, maybe they're not. So how does Mackie use the universe to suggest that there is an absolute meaning for the word great? Well, think about this. The universe is not infinitely big. It's got an absolute size. If you look at this news article, it took centuries, but we now know the size of the universe. And it is believed to be 93 billion light years in diameter. He uses the universe to suggest this. We can see this here when he mentions, makes sense to speak of all things getting bigger, of a universe that was expanding all over. And so it would make sense to speak of promoting greatness. So what would the absolute value of goodness be? Well, maybe goodness has an absolute value, which is God. And that's what we just said a minute ago from Aquinas' quote. Perhaps God is goodness. And therefore everything else in the world is simply relative to God. But what does Mackie conclude as to whether it solves the problem of evil? You see, he reels the religious person in by outlining the different views, and then one by one, he criticizes them. What does he conclude? Well, he simply says it doesn't solve the problem. Where do we get this from? It's when he says this: great and small are not logically necessary counterparts. In other words, you don't need some things to be small, he says, for other things to be big. The problem of evil is only solved if you can't have good without evil. Now, Mackie argues the solution fails. Either good and evil are relative, which make God's goodness meaningless, or goodness is an absolute, but evil is not necessary. Can you really, just think about this, have a world where everyone in it was absolutely good? Where everyone in it were godlike. They weren't just nice. Think about this. Is there a difference actually at the end of the day between goodness and greatness? Some may say yes, there is, because you have to choose goodness, but you may not be able to choose the size that you are. So choosing goodness implies that there could have been an evil choice to make instead. So Mackie goes on to admit that good and evil might be logical opposites, but he explains also why he doesn't think it makes any sense. Mackie distinguishes between two ways that things can be logical opposites. He refers to a linguistic principle, which we find here, and that's when we see him say, would belong only to our language. The principle would belong only to our language. This is the linguistic principle. Where's the other one? Well, here it is. It's when he refers to an ontological principle. Now, here's the definition of the two. Linguistic principles are things that we refer to when they are opposites in order to use the words meaningfully. So we need to understand the opposite meaning of something in order to understand that thing. The ontological principle are things that might be opposed in reality, which means the real existence of a being, the ontos, and therefore it's not just a play on words, or it's not just a linguistic device, but actually it's something which we believe is really real in reality when we talk about it. So let's unpack how Mackie talks about this. How does Mackie use redness to outline the linguistic principle first and foremost? Well, he effectively says that we need some things not to be red in order to understand what the word red actually means. Redness can occur, he says, only if non-redness also occurs. And so here we can see varieties of redness. And if we ask this question, what if everything in this world were red? What does Mackie suggest would happen to the word red? Well, he says it would become meaningless. It would become completely meaningless because we would have no word red. If everything were red, he says, we should not notice redness. It would become meaningless, and that shows the linguistic principle. You get the gist. How can you relate the linguistic principle then to good and to evil? Well, it's quite straightforward. You call some things evil in order to give the word good meaning. He says it here, good cannot exist without evil. And so this is the idea that our language helps us make sense of that. But Does Mackie think that this solves the problem of evil? No, of course he doesn't. Because if evil is only necessary linguistically, then God could have created a world simply without evil. We just wouldn't have realized it. We just have no concept of evil, and therefore it wouldn't really matter. But that's not the ontological reality, is it? Think about these questions. In a world with no evil, would concepts like honesty and compassion have no meaning? That's right. They probably wouldn't have any meaning at all, because we wouldn't know their opposites in reality. Now, what's the issue with God creating a world like that? The issue is that there is no free will to choose to do good. Would people be able to appreciate God and his creation if this were the case? Well, it's going to be either completely impossible or it would be seriously difficult for people to appreciate God and his creation if there were no evil. So can you think of which theodicy expects humans to transform themselves into God's likeness over time? That's right, it's the Irenaean theodicy, and it's Hick's soul-making theodicy, which he developed. So here's the pertinent question. Is evil a necessary means to goodness? So here, finally, Mackie considers the idea that evil might be necessary for goodness as an ontological principle. He's dismissed the linguistic principle now, not just necessary as a concept for goodness, but necessary for there to be goodness. So from this summary, what does Mackie believe is logically impossible? Well, simply put, it's logically impossible to create a world without evil. Let's highlight this sentence that's used, this phrase that Mackie uses here, when he refers to a minute and necessary dose. What is Mackie saying about necessary evil? Well, Mackie is saying that there only needs to be a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of evil to appreciate goodness. So how does he use redness again as an analogy to explain this point? Well, he says that there only needs to be a tiny amount of non-redness to appreciate red. The ontological requirement that non-redness should occur would be satisfied for a minute speck that were red. In other words, only a teeny, teeny, teeny bit of red needs to happen for you to appreciate, a tiny, tiny, teeny bit of non-redness needs to happen for you to appreciate redness. A teeny bit of green, a teeny bit of blue, whatever it is. Now, Mackie's conclusion is that God only needs to allow a small, small amount of evil for it to be necessary and for goodness to be appreciated. So what might a minute dose of evil actually look like? Well, it could look like a paper cut, a stubbed toe. It's painful, but it's not excessive. However, what is the reality which theists are more willing to point out? Well, they're quite happy to point out that the world has far more suffering than is necessary. That's pretty obvious. So here's some questions, and this is for you to think about. How much evil is necessary in a good world? Consider this. How might a Holocaust survivor respond to this point? Here's a quote from one, Simon Friedman. He said, "I cannot conceive of God being capable of performing miracles and refraining from doing it. I could not worship a God capable of preventing the horrors in the Nazi death campus who did not act." This is a Holocaust survivor. The faith that he once had in God diminished by the what seems to be illogical faith in a being that had the ability to prevent the horrors and yet seemingly didn't. If there is so much evil that exists, but only a tiny amount is necessary, why on earth would God allow this? So in response to Mackie, even with a minute speck of evil in a good world, will there ever be the right amount of evil to satisfy people? What's the potential problem here? We'll go back to the idea that a minute speck may be something like stubbing your toe or a paper cut. That would be the most intolerable evil and suffering to ever experience in the world. Because the worst events, the maximum events that ever existed, were you stubbing your toe and getting a paper cut. That would be treated with the same level as we might consider today of the fear of a mass murder. People might want less evil, for example, like a headache. So they may pine after it. They may complain and moan about the amount of stubbed toes and paper cuts that exist in the world. Why can't it be better than this? So we're left asking the question, what on earth is the right amount of a minute speck of evil? Now, something very interesting has happened here. There is a difference between the two pictures you now have in front of you. And Mackie has changed the focus of his argument. How has he done that? Well, the picture on the left is the logical problem of evil, which you're familiar with, the inconsistent triad. But the picture on the right has a small nuanced difference. Instead of it saying evil exists, it says excessive evil exists. So the picture on the right is actually known as the evidential problem of evil. You may have studied this if you studied Rowe's arguments. Mackie is now arguing for the evidential problem of evil instead of focusing on the logical contradiction that he is focusing on the idea of God making sense, but instead he's focusing on the idea that the universe doesn't provide enough evidence of this due to the excessive amount of evil in the world. So instead of the logical contradiction, he's now focusing on the evidence of so much evil that exists around us that it seems almost impossible that there would be such a God who is all-loving, or could be such a God who is all-loving and all-powerful. Do you remember earlier when Mackie said that theists turn upon some equivocation? And I asked you to remember that phrase. Is he not doing the same thing here? He accused religious people earlier of muddling their arguments, remember? Going to and fro between words and phrases, making them equivocal so they were muddled, and it was persuasive, but it was sly. Well, it appears so. He seems to be muddling his ideas together here to make the argument seem stronger, logical and evidential put together. So Mackie moves on now to deal with the second fallacious solution that is similar to the first one. The idea that evil may be a necessary means to bring about good, to bring about a good world, as opposed to a necessary part of creating one. It's titled, Evil is Necessary as a Means to Good. So what does Mackie mean when he says evil is necessary as a means for good? Well, it's a stepping stone to good. It's not something that you want, but it's something that you need. You need it as a means to an end. It's a stepping stone. Does a woman, for example, want to get pregnant? Well, probably not, because of the amount of pain that she's going to go through when she has labor. But she does want the child. So the pain of pregnancy is a means to having children. It's a means to an end, a stepping stone. What's the difference then between evil being a counterpart and evil being a means for good? We can see here he says, for good not as a counterpart, but as a means. And this is the distinction he's making here at this point. Well, to be clear, a counterpart means that evil is necessary, therefore God has to allow it when creating a good world. But if we talk about it as a means, then we're saying that evil is a necessary process of being exposed to it and therefore becoming a good person or a good world. And there is a clear difference here. So how does this explain Irenaeus and Hick's theodicies? Well, soul-making, humans can only grow into a morally perfect being if they suffer and they see others suffer. A means to an end, which is why he makes the distinction between a counterpart and a means. Instead of opposites, they are a means for good. So why does Mackie reject this solution as a severe restriction of God's power? Well, if evil is logically necessary, then an all-powerful God, an omnipotent God, may not be able to prevent it. Let's highlight that bit where he says this phrase. There it is. It obviously implies a severe restriction of God's power. So if evil is logically necessary, then an all-powerful God simply can't prevent it. And if evil is a means to good, then an omnipotent God should be able to avoid this. And this is the trap that Mackie sets. Either way, you simply can't solve the problem. Let's just think for a minute about the spider's web with the Prophet Muhammad in Islam. The spider's web concealed the Prophet Muhammad when he was hiding from the Quraysh who were trying to kill him. And this was during his hijrah to Medina from Mecca. Now, to save the Prophet Muhammad from the Quraysh, Allah performed a miracle and bypassed what would have taken a very long time for a spider's web in the natural to form. And instead, Allah, through his miracle power, enabled the spider to do it instantly, and it saved their lives. So what is Mackie's point about evil being a causal law, and how does this contradict God's nature? Let's just have a look at the text. There is a causal law. If God has to introduce evil as a means to good, he must be subject to at least some causal laws. Well, a cause always comes before an effect. If evil is a means to good, then it comes before goodness, and therefore evil is a causal law. Now, if God is transcendent, that means he exists outside of the laws of nature. He creates causal laws and he doesn't have to follow them, does he? He creates them, but he's outside of them. Therefore, he can do away with evil and he can simply create goodness. Prophet Muhammad's story there illustrates to us how God can create causal laws of nature but sit outside of them. Therefore, he can do anything, surely. So how do the design and the cosmological arguments demonstrate this, if we go back to our year 12 knowledge? Well, they both show that God is not bound by causal laws. They illustrate this further. He doesn't need a designer, or a mover, or a cause. And so therefore the cosmological argument shows us that God sits outside of movement and change because he is the prime mover. He is not part of the laws of cause and effect, but he is the first cause of the uncaused causer. He is not contingent on anything else to exist. He is therefore the necessary being. How does comic relief show that evil and suffering can be a means to good. March of this year, Comic Relief took place, as it does annually. Well, Comic Relief is using suffering to get people to donate their money. Therefore, evil and suffering, showing it, can be a means to good. Think about this statistic from an article of a study of the National Statistics, Office of National Statistics, back in 2017. They discovered that more than 51%, half of adults who were abused as children, experienced domestic abuse later in life. People who are abused as a child are more likely, statistically, to be abused as an adult. So how does that show that evil and suffering do not always, on the other hand, lead to goodness? Because people with abuse may go on to abuse themselves. If causal laws always end up with the desired effect, like gravity, then Mackie, is he wrong to assume that goodness always comes out of evil? Well, we probably would say, yes, he is wrong, because of free will. It doesn't always result in goodness. We've just seen two examples, one where it does and one where it doesn't. Perhaps he's wrong here. So the third fallacious solution, which Mackie highlights, similar to the last one, evil is a necessary means to goodness, but it is aimed this time at Augustine's theodicy rather than Irenaeus's. And it's very important to note that Mackie doesn't actually ever refer to Augustine or Irenaeus in his arguments. But the last one was Irenaeus, and this one is focusing on Augustine. Now, what does Mackie suggest Augustine believes about a world that didn't have any evil in it? Well, in effect, he argues that the world would be boring and uneventful. Let's highlight where he alludes to this. He says, the universe as a whole is better as it is, with some evil in it, than it would be if there were no evil in it. Now, Augustine called logically necessary evil metaphysical evil. God created a world with a range of beings in it. Some were taller, prettier, stronger than others. And Augustine, and we need to look at him here in a bit of context, because we know that Mackie is thinking of Augustine in his mind when he's talking about these solutions. Augustine uses the analogy of a painter to show a metaphysical evil doesn't count against God's goodness. Let's highlight where Mackie shows this. He talks about an aesthetic analogy by the fact that contrasts heighten beauty. That in a musical work, for example, there may occur discords which somehow add to the beauty of the work as a whole. This painting you can see, Giovanni Baglione, is Sacred and Profane, where love uses light and darkness, a painting technique that we can see taking place here. And it illustrates perfectly what Augustine's idea was. Augustine believed that we should count our blessings and we should look up to other people. The painter in that image shows the use of areas of darkness and of bright colors to bring an overall effect. Now, if you are in an area of dark pain, only you may wish for brighter colors, but you cannot see the whole picture because of the darkened pain that you're surrounded by. It doesn't necessarily mean that God isn't good just because a metaphysical evil is taking place. Now, according to Augustine, God created the best possible universe that exists, and therefore it was one that was varied, as we can see. But therefore the Garden of Eden had metaphysical danger, didn't it? And what made this far worse? It was the fall of Adam and Eve. That's what made the earth worse, according to Augustine. So what caused more natural evil in the world, according to Augustine? Well, natural evil is caused, and this is from your studies of the problem of evil in AS work, natural evil is caused by the sin, the fall of Adam and Eve, where God cursed the land out of his anger, his righteous anger for their disobedience. So let's bring in Leibniz here. How does this link to his principle of sufficient reason and the best of all possible worlds argument? Well, Leibniz argued that there should be a full and sufficient explanation for everything, even if we don't fully appreciate it yet. Since the world exists, God must have a reason for creating it rather than a different one that could exist. Since God is perfect, we have to assume that this must be the best of all possible worlds. Now, how is this different from Irenaeus and Hick's theodicies? Well, the difference is that he's not saying God deliberately created evil to make goodness, but it is the price instead that we pay for living in this world. That's the difference between Augustine and Irenaeus. We don't know whether God was able to remove some of these undesirable features or not. But this world, one thing we can be sure of is that it's the best version that could exist. So, let's move on. So here, Mackie expands on this solution, explaining how it appears to overcome criticisms by David Hume. Now, despite Mackie being a fan of David Hume, as he would be, what does he say of David Hume's approach to the problem of evil in this case? Well, we can find it here. He actually refers to in Hume's rather half-hearted presentation of the problem of evil. Rather interesting, not particularly flattering words. What does he say David Hume focuses on in his criticisms? Well, what he says, the reason he calls it half-hearted is because he says that David Hume focuses on the physical side of evil. And so it says he stresses pain and disease, how that makes possible, the existence of pain and disease makes possible the existence of sympathy and other things. So the next question I have to ask you is, what do the religious people respond with? So here we've got the two contrasting views. David Hume focuses on the physical, which Mackie says is a half-hearted approach because he only looks at pain and disease. But religious people say, which is what we started to highlight, that the existence of pain and disease, those things enable us to have sympathy, benevolence, heroism. And that's rather interesting because those qualities help us overcome evils. What is it that they bring out? They bring out, at the bottom here, the spiritual goods. So Mackie wants to give way here to the idea that actually the physical emphasis that David Hume has doesn't do enough justice to criticize religious belief here, because religious people simply will go to the idea that they have a deeper, greater purpose at stake here for evil to exist, because it leads to spiritual goods. It leads to these wonderful qualities that we as humans can have. How far, then, does disease inspire doctors to work on cures and for nurses to go to dangerous places to bring care to the sick? Let's have a look here at one example. Recently, this year, in London, a patient who had HIV was the second person in the world to be cured. The first was a man in Berlin, Germany. And this person has been cleared of a virus after getting stem cell donations. They no longer have to take their medication for HIV. We could also look at the well-known documented case of Pauline Cafferty, who was the Scottish nurse who went to Sierra Leone back in the time when Ebola virus had broken out to treat sufferers from the virus. She contracted the virus herself, and she was found to be in a critical condition, but she did recover. Let's have a little look at her speaking about this.
A really scary moment. I just had to try and keep it together. So I was just thinking I could die a horrible death within the next few days. The clinical lead down in the Royal Free, so he came to me in the tent and he told me, we're going to put you out as critical now. Being a nurse, if you hear the word critical, that means death is imminent. It was tough the first time, but second time round it was horrendous. There was so much wrong with my body, I wouldn't know where to start. Like, one side of my face was drooped. I had hearing loss and just having the worst headache of my life. Apparently I said to one of the doctors at one point, just drill a hole in my head. I was just a mess, a real mess, physically and emotionally, a wreck.
How did you cope with it?
My friends and family have been massively supportive. And even down to the people who sent me cards and letters. I couldn't believe strangers would actually feel the need to write to me. I'm nothing special, I'm just a nurse doing a job who got unlucky and caught a virus.
So we could ask, are these the spiritual goods that Mackie mentions that theists believe in? When we listen to that great story there. Well, quite possibly. This is considered to be the best sort of world that God created, with the pain and with the disease that exist in it. So now, Mackie does something that is typical of philosophers. He splits an idea into different subtypes and he numbers them 1 and 2 in order to compare them. And it's worth you definitely noting down what these numbers mean and their definitions, so that every time they're used in the text, it's very quick and easy for you to understand what Mackie is referring to. So first of all, what does Mackie call pain? Well, let's highlight that. He calls pain first order evil, which is otherwise known as evil 1. Highlight this here, pain and misery, first order evil or evil 1. What does Mackie call pleasure or happiness? He calls pleasure and happiness first order good or good 1. Now Mackie imagines that second order goodness, known as good 2, what kind of world do you get that kind of goodness in? Well, he says it's a world in which evil 1 exists. Evil 1 here is a necessary component. So distinct from the first order evil and the first order good is the second order good, which somehow emerges in a complex situation in which evil 1 is a necessary component. So what are the examples that Mackie gives here of good 2? Well, good 2, he says, are things like happiness instead of misery, sympathy instead of suffering, heroism instead of fear of danger. So you can only get those things, sympathy, happiness, heroism, etc., if you have the existence of first order evil in the world. So what does Mackie say that theists believe about second order goods? Well, he says here that good 2 is more important than good 1 or good or evil 1. Second order good is more important than first order good or evil. Now, what does this mean for God when creating the best world? Well, it means that he would have to create a world with good 2 in it. There has to therefore be a world with sympathy, happiness, heroism, and all those great things. And that means it has to be a world then which evil 1 must exist in too. Therefore, pain and misery is necessary for good 2. Now, this is similar to previous arguments that we've had, that evil is necessary as a means to good, a stepping stone to good. However, this time it avoids arguing that evil is causally necessary to produce goodness. What does this avoid? Well, it avoids Mackie's previous criticism that if omnipotence means anything at all, then it ought to mean the ability to bring about effects without causes. So this argument says that evil one is a logically necessary part of good two. Pain and misery, logically necessary for happiness, pleasure, etc. Go back to the pregnant woman analogy again. What causes pregnancy? Well, your biology lessons should tell you that it's sexual intercourse. Can you think of a time when God in religion has brought about pregnancy without sexual intercourse? Yes, the virgin birth of Jesus by Mary. But still, Mary had to carry the baby. Now, an all-powerful, omnipotent God didn't make a woman pregnant without her carrying the baby. The expectation, the process was still there. So maybe evil one, pain, is a part of good two, happiness. Maybe that's a decent defense and argument. But let's link this to ethics for a moment. Utilitarianism. In what way did Mill improve on Bentham's utilitarianism? Can you remember? He improved on it by making a distinction between higher order and lower order pleasures. So what would he call second order goods? That's right, he would call second order goods higher pleasures. Now Mackie shows appreciation for the solution. He doesn't agree with it, but he thinks it is subtle or clever. We can see this phrase here, subtle attempt. He thinks it's a subtle or clever attempt. Now, what does Mackie say about good eliminating evil? Well, he moves away from the idea that goodness eliminates evil wherever it can. Do you remember his definition going back a few times before? He says it here. Good does not tend to eliminate evil in general. There it is. Now, what is the theist now proposing that goodness is more interested in doing? What does the theist propose that goodness is more interested in doing? Well, the theist will propose that goodness is more interested in minimizing evil, which is evil one, in order to maximize good two. So we need to minimize pain and misery to maximize happiness. We can find it here when Mackie says, it is rather the will to maximize second order good. So instead of God wanting to make us simply happy, what does he want instead? Well, he wants to be deeper. He wants us to go deeper, to have more compassion, to be more heroic, even if we're not as happy as we could be. We find it here when Mackie writes, maximize second order good. You see here, some second order goods try to maximize first order good and minimize first order evil. But instead, it is rather the will to maximize second order good. So instead of God wanting to make us simply happy, he wants us to maximize further happiness, the higher pleasures, to take us beyond. So what does Mackie say of this position? Well, Mackie says that it is a more accurate description of the essential theist position. to give a more accurate description with the essential theist position. How does Muhammad's hijrah and Jesus's crucifixion show the idea of evil one bringing about evil two? Well, think about this. The hijrah saved Muhammad's life and enabled Mecca to be restored later on. The crucifixion enabled the salvation of the world. Yet Muhammad was persecuted and Jesus was tortured and killed. These ideas assume that God brought good two out of evil one. So Mackie puts forward two minor criticisms of this solution. He knows that theists have answers to them. The phrase a fortiori means even more so, or most of all. Let's highlight that phrase there. First, some might argue that such qualities as benevolence, and even more so the third order goodness. So what is Mackie's criticism of good two here? Well, he's saying that good two isn't really a higher sort of good after all. He says it has a merely derivative value. Let's see where he says that. Have a merely derivative value. What does he say is the only real sort of good? He says the only real sort of good, merely means to good, is good one. Happiness. That's the only real sort of good that exists. What does he say of the virtues of benevolence, such as heroism, scientific discovery, courage, compassion, all of these things? What does he say of these things? He says that we only value these things because they make people happy. It's the only reason. That to happiness, so that it would be absurd for God to keep misery in existence in order to make possible the virtues of benevolence, heroism, etc. He's saying that we only want them because they make us happy. So when Mackie says God is not, in our sense, benevolent or sympathetic, highlight this here, God is not, in our sense, benevolent or sympathetic. What is his second criticism of the solution? Well, his second criticism involves redefining God's goodness. What are God's intentions in this redefinition? Well, his intentions are not to eliminate evil, pain and misery, evil one, but to increase happiness, good two. Sympathy, courage, all these things. God's intention, when the definition is redefined, is not to eliminate evil. So before, remember Mackie's definition of this omnipotent God is that he will want to eliminate evil completely and bring about good. But now we're saying his will is not to eliminate evil fully, but to increase goodness only. And this creates a world where heroes and saints and even are still there, even if people are miserable. What does Mackie say this is for some theists? He says what happens is it becomes a disturbing conclusion. Now remember, what is Mackie doing? He's pointing out in these fallacious solutions of these classic traditional defenses of God that what the theist ends up having to do is to compromise on their traditional views about God. And so this is a disturbing point, a disturbing conclusion for the religious believer at this point. Are compassion and heroism only valuable because they make people happy? Is that the only reason we value them? It's a point of discussion. But Mackie doesn't want to go there. He avoids having this discussion. So maybe we should move on with it too. Why might Mackie not want to press this objection further? Well, because religious people simply deny it. Is Bentham's utilitarianism, in it, he believes that pleasure and pain, good one and evil one, are mankind's two sovereign masters. Do you remember that? Well, what does Mill call this philosophy? What does he call the philosophy? If you remember, he refers to it as a pig's philosophy. The idea that God wants to bring about a race of spiritual heroes without caring about the amount of unhappiness that still exists in the world along the way is troubling to theists. And this debate goes further than Mackie's essay, and he doesn't want to explore it further. He doesn't go down that road. So think about this for a minute. How do parents work towards good 2 rather than good 1? Children, for example, as a comparison. Well, most parents are prepared to let their children be unhappy on occasions. So, for example, you make your child go to school. You make them do chores in the house. You punish them if they don't do what you want. Good 2 would be things like being successful from your education, rather than simply good 1, which is just being happy and watching television and eating sweets all day. There's a higher goodness, a higher pleasure and happiness that can come out of the things that sometimes parents are prepared to do to make their children unhappy, to give them a greater happiness later on. Are parents then who spoil their children to make them happy, to get good 1, good parents? Most people would say not. Now, Mackie moves on to his third criticism, which he thinks is the strongest one. He calls it fatal objection, right there. His killer criticism to the whole argument takes place in this text. Now, if there are second-order goods, known as good 2, then there must be what else? You've got it. There's got to be second-order evils. There it is. Pain is evil 1. So what would cruelty be? That's right. It would be evil 2. It's a second-order evil. There's it. Malevolence, cruelty, callousness, cowardness, states in which good 1 is decreasing. These are the things which are considered to be evil 2. If God were willing to put up with evil 1 for the sake of promoting good 2, then what does Mackie say God would want to eliminate? What he's going to want to eliminate are evil 2. He wants evil 2 to be eliminated. So evil 2 will by analogy be the important kind of evil, the kind which God, if he were wholly good and omnipotent, would eliminate. So what does Mackie say, however, still plainly exists, this phrase here that he uses? Well, Mackie says, look around you, evil 2 still exists. So, what might a theist use as a defense to the argument that God simply cannot eliminate evil 2? In fact, let's just take a quick step back and highlight what Mackie says about this current solution that has been presented. What does he call it and why? Let's just highlight quickly this word, useless. He calls it completely useless. It takes us around in a circle. Either God lacks the power to eliminate cruelty and the like, such as evil 2, or he doesn't really want to. So we go back to the drawing board, and that's what Mackie says here about this solution. So let's go back to the question that the theist might need to answer. What are they going to do to defend the argument that God simply cannot eliminate evil 2? Well, one of the arguments they'll have is the free will defense. God would be destroying free will, therefore, of course, he cannot eliminate evil 2. Mackie deals with this in the next section. So how might theists then use Augustine's theodicy to deal with Mackie's criticism? Well, remember this, evil 2 does not really exist. It's simply, what would Augustine say? A privation of good. Therefore, cruelty is just a lack of kindness. Again, this has already been dealt with by Mackie earlier in the essay. So it probably doesn't help us at this stage to bring it back again. Now, Mackie deals with some final arguments before moving on to the free will defense. So what's the problem if one argued that good 2 are just necessary ingredients of good 3 or good 4 or good 5, etc.? Well, there would also be evil 3, wouldn't there? The opposite. There would be evil 4, there would be evil 5, etc. So there's a danger here of an infinite regress, of trying to define goodness that would end up going on forever and ever. Now, if good 3, for example, might be bringing about an increase of good 2, i.e., God has good 3 since he's creating a world where courage and compassion can flourish even further, the devil might then have, as we just said, evil 3, as he's trying to increase evil 2 by cruelty and selfishness by tempting people. So here's the point. Why doesn't God simply destroy the devil or stop him from tempting people? The idea that God doesn't destroy the devil because he has free will gets dealt with next. So how does a world with the devil in it create the infinite regress that Mackie warns about? Well, if the world has a devil in it, then there can be devil worshippers that exist. They worship the evil rather than doing the evil. And that gives way for good 4 and evil 4 to match it, and so forth. And it becomes an infinite regress. And so now we move on to the fourth and final fallacious solution that Mackie deals with, the free will defense. And this was proposed by Alvin Plantinga in the 1970s. It should take you back to your work on the problem of evil. And Swinburne, who you may also be familiar with, argues it today. It is central to all of the theodicies that you have encountered in some way or another. Evil is due to human free will. So in what way does Mackie admit that his third objection to necessary evil can be avoided? Let's highlight his solution. If the religious believer links evil to human free will, then it can be avoided. So let's highlight this section here. First order evil, such as pain, may be justified as a logically necessary component in second order good. We could call that sympathy. While second order evil, such as cruelty, is not justified, but is so ascribed to human beings that God cannot be held responsible for it. Therefore, we end up avoiding the objection to necessary evil if the religious believer links evil to human free will. So if God is good and perfect, what kind of people does he not want to create? Well, we can find that here when Mackie says, then that they should be innocent automata. He doesn't want to create robots or machines, automatons. So what kind of good is free will, and what does it justify? So free will is, according to Mackie, third order good. Freedom, that is to say, is now treated as a third order good, which justifies a second order evil, such as cruelty. So let's watch a short video to recap what the free will defense is all about.
We live in a world festering with moral evil, a world of wars, torture, rape, murder, and other acts of meaningless violence. In every city in the world every day, there are people deliberately inflicting pain on humans and other animals, and even enjoying others' suffering. There's also natural evil, such as disease, famine, floods, and earthquakes. This is terrible but undeniable. For anyone who believes in the existence of a benevolent God, who is also all-knowing and all-powerful, this presents a powerful challenge. A problem. The problem of evil. How could a good God allow anyone to do such horrific things? If God is all-knowing, then he or she or it is completely aware of what's going on, and if all-powerful, could easily stop it. Yet the thunderbolts don't come. Many atheists have taken the existence of so much evil as conclusive proof that there can't be a good God, and that there probably isn't a God at all. The problem of evil seems to be a genuine problem for anyone who wants to believe that there is. One response, the free will defense, is this. God could have created human beings that always did the right thing, never harmed anyone else, never went astray, but that would have made us automata, pre-programmed robots. It's far better to have free will with the genuine risk that some people will end up evil than to live in a world without choice. That's the claim. Victims of Caligula, Genghis Khan, Hitler, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, and the rest might disagree. And even if you accept the free will defense, it doesn't explain natural evil.
So it's worth having a brief discussion about this. Which world would work better? You need to decide whether you think that a world full of automatons, but without any evil, would be a better world. Or whether a world with beings that have free will, yet a world that has evil, would be better. Does free will lead to unhappiness? These are questions to wrestle with. And what analogy do parents and teachers offer to describe the kind of desire that God might have for humans to have free will? This is the kind of God, perhaps, which can be defended. Most parents want their children to grow up making their own choices. Bad parents want to treat their children like slaves. Teachers want their students to be independent thinkers. These are surely all good things. And as we move on, Mackie thinks that free will is incoherent. In other words, it makes no sense, and he goes on to explain why. Let's highlight that phrase, because of the incoherence of the notion of freedom of the will. Let's find and highlight the related quotes to these points. Having free will doesn't mean there has to be evil. Well, the quote that goes with that is here. Second-order evils are logically necessary accompaniments of freedom. The other one is choices don't mean they must choose evil. Choices doesn't mean that they must choose evil. Well, we can find that here. Why could he not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? Since humans choose to be good on some occasions, what does Mackie suggest? Well, he suggests that they should be able to choose to do good on every occasion. What does Mackie end up suggesting that God could have done but clearly hasn't done? Let's highlight the inconsistency that Mackie focuses on. Now, God could have created humans with free will who make better choices than we do. Instead, we exist and we make bad choices. So this makes God, according to Mackie, inconsistent with his being both omnipotent and wholly good. So Mackie argues that theists are committing something called the fallacy of a false dilemma. This is when there are two choices that are presented, yet more actually exist between the choices, but they're not offered. So what could be the third option that Mackie suggests? Well, a world of humans with free will who choose to be good all the time. And since there are serial killers in the world, and let's say you're not one, why didn't God make a world full of people like you? Well, moral behavior is linked to character. God could have made sure that everyone had a good character, that they were kind, that they were honest, still with free will at the same time, but making better choices than they do. What part of your ethics you've probably studied in A2 can this relate to? Well, the link here would be to virtue ethics, having good moral character. And some further food for thought. Mackie is a compatibilist. That's important to note. Write down the definition. A compatibilist is someone who believes that free will is compatible with God determining how we behave. The two can go together. Alvin Plantinga, however, is an incompatibilist. He believes that to be truly free, people have to act against God's will. Where do you sit? Mackie goes on to defend compatibilism, and he explains why he thinks that free will stems from your character rather than being entirely a random thing. Now, what are Mackie's two different senses of freedom, which he argues that theists confuse with each other? And we can see him saying this here. I conclude that to make this solution plausible, two different senses of freedom must be confused. What does he suggest that they are? Well, one of the senses of freedom that he believes theists confuse with the other type of freedom called complete randomness. And you can find that up here. Complete randomness. Now that means not to be caused by anything else at all. So it's completely random, it's not caused by anything. The second type of freedom he argues that theists confuse are the one that is determined by their characters, and you find that here. This means as long as nothing prevents this from happening. Determined by their characters as long as nothing prevents this from happening. If free will is random, then God is not responsible for our actions. He's got no role to play in it. So why does Mackie think that this cannot be true free will? He says, how can it be a characteristic of will? He doesn't think it could be true free will. It's not intentional, and therefore it's not considered to be third order goodness, good three, as it doesn't reflect the character. That's why it can't be characteristic of will. It's not true free will. If free will then is character, and it's not random, but it's character, then it can be considered a third order good. What is the problem that Mackie highlights with this sense of freedom? Well, this is the freedom that God is responsible for as he gives us our character. And again, you can see the trap that Mackie lays. So what if every decision that you made was based on the toss of a coin? Your behavior would be random, but you wouldn't be morally responsible. Free actions outside of your control. And what if every decision that you made was based on your character? It was consistent with who you are as a person. Free actions, so long as there are no barriers and you have responsible choices. This is the dichotomy, the confusion that Mackie points out between the two that theists make. Random free will, character-based free will. Free will determined by character is what theists are going to want to argue. But the problem here is that it means that God is responsible for evil. And so Mackie offers two options and forces us to choose one. He's done it here in this text. Which one are you going to go for? If you're a theist, you want to go for the one that says it's character-based because that makes sense, but God is responsible. If you go for the random one, then God has no responsibility for it whatsoever. He seems to be using what's called the fallacy of false dilemma. This is when you present two opposing options that make them seem like they're the only possibilities that exist. But I'll let you into a secret. There's usually a third option. So Mackie explores another confusing issue with free will. Is it beyond God's control, or does he just choose not to control it? Let's highlight and label the two alternatives that Mackie offers. So the first is where it says he cannot control their wills. Highlight that. That means free will is beyond the control of God. Or the second alternative, he always refrains from controlling their wills. That means he chooses not to. Now, which idea of these two shows free will to be a higher order good and more important than a lower order evil? Well, it's the second one, the fact that he chooses not to. So let's highlight the quote by Mackie, which shows this solution to evil means that God does absolutely nothing about sin. It's here, where he says, this is utterly opposed to what theists say about sin in other contexts. It does nothing to deal with sin. Which of the two alternatives does Mackie believe that theists are forced to accept then in this case? Well, he believes that theists are forced to accept that free will is beyond God's control then. How would you feel if a policeman stood and watched a crime take place and only intervened after it was committed to arrest the criminal? How would you feel about that? Maybe you've seen that happen, but it would be a kind of corruption, wouldn't it? Or a negligence on the police part. And that is what God seems to be doing, according to Mackie, watching it take place and only intervening after it has been committed. And since Mackie commits the fallacy of false dilemma, what is this third mysterious option then that he seems to leave out of the two offered? Well, we could say that God can and does interfere with free will, but we never notice it. In religion, especially Christianity, you may read in the Bible about spiritual warfare, that there is in the invisible world things taking place that we just never notice. That could be a defense. It's one of the things Mackie doesn't really touch upon. If God prevents some abuses of free will, why doesn't he prevent all of them then? If God allows the Holocaust, for example, how evil do human actions actually need to be before God chooses to intervene? And that takes us right back to the same issues that we had before in the beginning. And so Mackie now introduces what's called the paradox of omnipotence, and he explains why the very concept of omnipotence might not make sense. So what exactly is a paradox? A paradox is a contradictory idea. It seems true and it seems false, both at the same time. What is the paradox of omnipotence? Well, it's here, where he says, can an omnipotent being make things which he cannot subsequently control? If God can create something that he cannot control, what does this mean? Well, it means that then there is something outside of his control. In other words, he's actually not omnipotent. So if God cannot create something that he cannot control, what does this mean? Well, that means that there is something he cannot simply do. Therefore, again, it means he's not omnipotent. Now, this is the famous analogy. If God is omnipotent, can he create a rock that's so heavy that he cannot lift it? This takes us right back to the discussion earlier in the essay on omnipotence at the start. What would Aquinas say about this paradox? The paradox points out that either way you can't win. God is going to be not omnipotent. If he can create a stone that's too heavy to lift, then by doing that, he's created something which he then cannot do because he can't lift it. If he can't create a stone that's too heavy to lift, then straight away he can't do something. So what would Aquinas say? Well, Aquinas, if you remember, we've said this a few times, he says that God can do anything that is logically possible. So therefore, this paradox is simply logically impossible. Therefore, it's irrelevant, it's meaningless, as perhaps C.S. Lewis would say. Just because you put the words God can in front of the sentence, it doesn't mean anything. Let's take the idea of this then. Controlling an uncontrollable creature, there's a Tasmanian devil. Controlling an uncontrollable creature is also a logical impossibility. So then would that mean that if you were to create a free-willed creature that can be controlled, that would also be a logical impossibility? Doesn't seem to make much sense for the creator of the world. Saying that God cannot do something because it is impossible is not saying that God lacks power. Maybe Aquinas is perfectly fine to have influenced the Catholic Church with this view. Are impossible things really things at all? Probably not, because actually they are meaningless things. If something is impossible, then it's not actually a thing to be possible with. Many theists argue that God allows free will, but we are not fully free due to being slaves to sin. This is a very Christian idea. We're only ever going to be completely free when we die and get to heaven. Now, can you think of the theodicies which argue that God creates humans with the potential to be free over time, but we have to work on it right now for the future? That's right, it's the Irenaean theodicy, and it's Hick's soul-making theodicy. In fact, there's a third one, isn't there? Process theology also argues that we're only going to be free in the future. Now, Mackie has a very brief discussion here about theological determinism. So what's theological determinism? This is the belief that there is no free will and God is in control of everything that happens. Why does Mackie start discussing this view instead of free will? Well, theological determinists believe that when God creates a soul, he can see whether it goes to heaven or whether it goes to hell, because he's omniscient, he's all-knowing. And the human soul cannot, whatever it chooses to do, change that course of action. We can read about that here. Talks about theological determinists. And then he says, a human machine has made a machine which he cannot control. And we see that up here. A human mechanic has made a machine which he cannot control. Now, for a theological determinist, God can and does control the fate of a human soul. So why does Mackie start discussing this view instead of free will then? Well, if God creates a human that will go to hell and then uses his power to save the human, he isn't really omnipotent after all. Why doesn't Mackie think that this view solves the paradox of omnipotence? If If God creates the human that will go to hell and then uses the power to save the human, he's not going to be omnipotent, is he? Because he failed to create a human who would go to hell. If he can't save the human, then he's not omnipotent either. He can't do something. Effectively, it's the same sort of principle as before. You can't get out of it by talking about theological determinism, and you can't get out of it by talking about free will. Either way, there is a paradox that locks God in to being someone who is not, a being which is not omnipotent after all. Mackie now goes on to explore the paradox of omnipotence further. He compares God's power with the power of parliamentary laws, the power that Parliament has to make laws. What is parliamentary sovereignty? Something which he says here, the paradox of sovereignty. This is the power that Parliament has to pass laws. What two types of sovereignty does Mackie split them into? What are they? Well, he splits them into first order sovereignty, which is sovereignty 1. And he does that down here. That's the power to pass laws that affect people. So, for example, when government years ago banned cigarettes in public places, in restaurants, inside, etc. That was first order sovereignty, parliamentary laws of sovereignty, being able to pass a law that bans cigarettes. The second type is second order sovereignty, and that's there. Sovereignty 2. This is the power to pass laws that affect other laws, such as, for example, banning the future government from legalizing, let's say, cannabis. So if the current government was able to invoke a second order sovereignty, sovereignty 2, they are able to pass laws that stop governments from making further laws about something later on. In this case, let's say, legalizing cannabis. So what's the paradox of sovereignty then that Mackie outlines? Well, if Parliament uses sovereignty 2, the one where you can ban governments in the future from passing laws like legalizing cannabis, then future governments later on will lose their sovereignty 1. They don't have it anymore because they're limited in what they can do. And if future governments use sovereignty 2 to then free themselves up to pass the laws again and get rid of the previous government's use of sovereignty 2, then the old Parliament never really had sovereignty 2 in the first place, because what they did simply just gets ignored later on. So it becomes a paradox. So how does Mackie apply this paradox to God? Well, it's quite straightforward. If God binds himself to a law, such as respecting human free will, then he stops being omnipotent. If he can overrule his own laws, then he was never omnipotent in the first place. So what is Mackie doing with this whole analogy? What he's doing is he's reinforcing exactly the same point as before, just in a different way. If God created free creatures and promised to respect their freedom of choice, he stops being omnipotent as he cannot do something. If he breaks his own promise, he was never omnipotent to begin with, as the creatures have no free will after all. That's the paradox. Now, some theists reject Mackie's talk here about before and after, because they claim that it doesn't actually apply to God to talk about God in this way. Now, what about God's nature would Aquinas and the Catholic Church say shows this? Well, it's the fact that they believe God is eternal. He's transcendent. He exists outside of time and space. That means God has no before or after. Well, Mackie picks up on this and he deals with it. And so here, Mackie considers whether an eternal God outside of time and space will solve the paradox of omnipotence. Is it good enough? So what is Mackie willing to admit in his alternative solution. Here we see the phrase, an alternative solution to this paradox. Well, he's willing to admit that an eternal God, simply deny that God is a continuing being is a solution to the paradox. To simply deny that God is a continuing being. In other words, to deny that he is a continuing being would therefore solve the problem, if you accept he's eternal. But what's the problem with that? Well, Mackie says that it creates a new set of paradoxes. Here he says, but the free will solution of the problem of evil cannot be saved in this way. It creates more problems. Solves one thing, opens a can of worms elsewhere. From the last sentence in what Mackie says here, what is he saying it is difficult to comprehend? Look at the last sentence. And equally, it remains impossible to hold that omnipotent God binds himself by causal or logical laws. What's he saying it's difficult to comprehend? He's saying it's difficult to see how a being that doesn't have a past or a future could possibly create anything or change anything at all. Now, why might Mackie seem hesitant to discuss this a little bit further in his essay? Because he doesn't really go on any more about it. Well, it's a very heavy philosophy. It's a very complicated idea that he's wrestling with here. Now, what kind of being was Aristotle's prime mover that Aquinas adopted for his cosmological argument the first way, but he adapted because he was a god of classical theism? Think back to the beginning of AS. Aristotle's prime mover is a being that is outside of time and space, but has no personal interest whatsoever in humans or any awareness of them. We know that the belief that Aristotle would have had as a Greek philosopher was far different and removed from Aquinas in this sense. This being, in fact, spent eternity contemplating itself with no awareness of humans. Now, if theists claim that God is like Aristotle's prime mover with no past or future, they're going to have problems explaining how this being can act. How can this being possibly perform miracles, intervene, answer prayers, create humans with free will? It seems impossible. Why is this such a problem for belief in God? Well, because if you act, then there has to be logically a time before you've acted and a time after you've acted. But there is no before or after with a timeless God. So it doesn't seem to make sense. And so we get to the final conclusion. Mackie offers his conclusion. None of the solutions to the problem of evil and suffering by theists he believes are persuasive. Some of them he considers to be adequate, but half-hearted, and possibly even dishonest. Others of them he considers to be fallacious. Now, what process did Mackie take throughout the whole of this essay to draw these conclusions? What he did was he highlighted each solution, not by name, but by which part of the problem of evil they claim to solve. Omnibenevolence, omnipotence, the reality of evil, instead of talking about Augustinian, Irenaeus, Hick, etc. And one by one, he showed that they either don't solve the problem or that they end up creating a new problem elsewhere. What conclusions does Mackie draw then about omnipotence? Well, he says that when it comes to omnipotence, it's full of problems and full of questions as to whether it can be meaningful, he says, to ascribe to God. And he says that here at the bottom. Can you ascribe meaningfully the phrase omnipotence, the idea of omnipotence, to God? He's implying that to talk of God's omnipotence is incoherent or meaningless. Now, by not addressing the solutions directly, except for Plantinga's free will defense, which he does, but instead being really general about theism, how simplistic throughout this whole essay has Mackie been? Well, theists are probably going to argue that he was really simplistic throughout. He fails to recognize that theists will have specific answers, often that come from scripture, or their own worldviews that are very unique to them to answer Mackie's criticisms. And Mackie is perhaps too general for his own good.